October 25th, 1944, 6:58 hours. 7 miles off Samar Island, Philippines. Commander Ernest Evans stood on the bridge of USS Johnston, a Fletcher-class destroyer displacing 2,100 tons, and watched 4 Japanese battleships emerge from the rain squall, range 18,000 yards. His escort carrier group, 6 thin-skinned jeep carriers and 7 destroyers faced center force. 4 battleships, 6 heavy cruisers and 11 destroyers. Yamato alone outweighed Johnston by a factor of 34. Evans had 3 choices: run, screen the carriers with smoke, or charge. His crew had loaded 5 Mark 15 torpedoes, steam-driven, 6 500-yard range, 825-pound warheads into tubes, 16 minutes earlier. The main battery, 5 5-inch 38 dual-purpose guns, could hurl a 55-pound shell every 3 seconds to 18,000 yards, but penetrating 14 inches of belt armor required something closer than physics allowed. Evans turned Johnston into the enemy column. How does a destroyer weighing less than a single Yamato turret survive a gun duel with the largest battleship afloat? The answer emerged in the next 73 minutes. The first salvo arrived at 6:59, geysers erupted 300 yards to port. Dyed crimson so Japanese spotters could distinguish their ship's fire. Evans counted the splashes, 9 columns, each taller than Johnston's mast. Yamato had opened at extreme range with her forward turret, 3 18-inch rifles capable of hurling 3 200-pound armor-piercing shells 26 miles. The physics were straightforward. 1 shell contained more explosive than Johnston's entire forward magazine. A direct hit would detonate the ship from keel to weather deck. Evans called down to the engine room. Chief Machinist's mate Harold Ellsworth answered over the sound-powered phone, his voice competing with the roar of 4 Babcock and Wilcox boilers, pushing superheated steam to 2 General Electric turbines. Evans wanted every available horsepower. Ellsworth confirmed all 4 boilers online, turbines at maximum revolutions. Johnston's screws bit into the Philippine Sea at 35 knots, the destroyer's theoretical maximum in calm water. The sea was not calm. Swells ran 6 feet, legacy of a tropical depression that had passed through 2 days earlier. The hull shuddered with each impact, spray sheeting across the foredeck. Fire Controlman Robert Hagen crouched in the Mark 37 director, an analog computer mounted above the bridge that calculated firing solutions using optical rangefinders and gyroscopic stabilization, and tracked the lead battleship through his optics. The pagoda mast identified her as Congo-class, possibly Haruna, range 16,200 yards and closing. Hagen's director fed constant data to the 5-inch guns, target bearing, range rate, own ship's course and speed. The Mark 37 could predict where a moving target would be when a shell arrived, compensating for time of flight, wind drift, and the Coriolis effect. It could not compensate for the reality that Johnston's guns maxed out at 18,000 yards while Japanese heavy cruisers could reach 25,000. Hagen called Rangers to gun Captain Thomas Whelan in Mount 51, the forward turret. Whelan's crew had already loaded armor-piercing rounds, though AP shells designed for 5-inch guns were optimistic against battleship plate. The rounds would work against cruiser armor at the right angle and range. Everything depended on getting close enough to matter. Evans studied the enemy formation through binoculars. The Japanese had arranged themselves in a classic anti-aircraft disposition, columns of heavy units with destroyers screening the flanks. They were not expecting surface action. Admiral Kurita had taken center force through San Bernardino Strait during the night, bypassing Admiral Halsey's fast battleships, which had raced north chasing a decoy carrier force. The maneuver had been brilliant. Now Kurita's fleet stood between Taffy 3, the escort carriers Johnston was sworn to protect, and open water. The carriers could manage 17 knots on a good day with a following sea. Center force could make 27. Simple mathematics gave the carriers 30 minutes before 18-inch guns found their range. unless something disrupted the Japanese formation, unless someone forced Kurita to maneuver, to divide his attention, to question his intelligence about American strength. Johnston's torpedo officer, Lieutenant Jack Hartigan, reported tubes ready. The Mark 15 torpedo packed an 825-pound Torpex warhead, a mixture of RDX, TNT and aluminum powder yielding 40% more blast than pure TNT, and used a steam turbine to drive contra-rotating propellers at 46 knots to 6,500 yards. It required precise depth settings, ran hot or cold depending on water temperature, and occasionally executed a circular run that endangered the launching ship. Hartigan's team had checked each torpedo twice. The weapons were cold, meaning they would not leave a telltale wake of bubbles, but cold torpedoes ran slower, 42 knots instead of 46. Hartigan wanted to launch at 8,000 yards, where the runtime gave minimal opportunity for evasive action, but maximized probability of hitting something in the enemy column. Evans agreed. 8,000 yards meant Johnston had to close another 8,000 yards while under fire from the entire Japanese formation. The second salvo arrived at 7:01, closer. 2 shells landed within 100 yards of Johnston's starboard side, close enough that fragments clattered against the hull. Seaman Bill Mercer, manning the port 40mm Bofors, mount a Swedish-designed automatic cannon, firing 2-pound high-explosive shells at 120 rounds per minute, ducked as shrapnel pinged off the gun shield. The Bofors were useless in a surface action. Their maximum range barely exceeded 4,000 yards, but Mercer stayed at his post because Evans had not ordered him elsewhere. Below deck in the forward engine room, Ellsworth monitored steam pressure across 4 gauges. The boilers were redlined, producing steam at 634 pounds per square inch and 850 degrees Fahrenheit. The turbines converted that pressure into 60,000 shaft horsepower, enough to push Johnston's 2,100 tons through the water at speeds that made the hull flex. Ellsworth could hear the frame groaning. Fletcher-class destroyers were built light to maximize speed and armament. The price was structural fragility. Sustained high-speed maneuvering in rough seas could crack welds. Sustained fire from 18-inch guns could do worse. Evans ordered a zigzag pattern, course changes every 40 seconds to spoil enemy fire control. The maneuver worked against submarines and aircraft. Against battleship main batteries it bought seconds, not survival. Japanese spotters adjusted. The third salvo, arriving at 7:03, straddled Johnston. 4 shells landed to port, 4 to starboard, 1 short, 1 over. The precision indicated the enemy had bracketed the range and would land shells on target with the next salvo. Evans called for smoke. Chief Boatswain's mate Arthur Smith triggered the chemical smoke generator Mark IV, a device that injected oil into the destroyer's exhaust system. Superheated oil vaporized and billowed from the stacks in dense white clouds. Within 30 seconds, Johnston trailed a smoke screen 800 yards long. The wind, blowing east-northeast at 12 knots, carried the screen toward the Japanese column. Evans turned Johnston to parallel the enemy course, staying in the smoke, making targeting impossible. The tactic bought 90 seconds. Japanese cruisers shifted fire to other targets, destroyers Hole and Harriman, which had begun their own torpedo runs. Range to the nearest battleship, 12,400 yards. Hagen updated firing solutions every 6 seconds. The Mark 37 director hummed with the sound of motors adjusting the optics. Hagen's trainer, Seaman Dennis Hale, tracked targets through a separate telescope, confirming ranges by visual estimate when radar echoes became ambiguous in the clutter of shell splashes. The system was analog but effective. During Johnston's shakedown cruise in 1943, Hagen's team had put 4 out of 5 practice rounds inside a 100-yard circle at 15,000 yards. Live combat introduced variables practice never replicated. Maneuvering targets, return fire, smoke, sea state, fear. Hall's hands trembled slightly on the controls. He had turned 19 3 weeks earlier. This was his first surface engagement. He kept his eye pressed to the optic and called ranges. At 7:06, Evans ordered main battery commence firing. Mount 51, the forward twin turret, fired first. The guns recoiled 4 feet. Spent cases ejecting through ports on the turret's sides. The crew reloaded in 5 seconds, ramming 55-pound shells into the breech, followed by powder cases, closing the block, reporting ready. Mount 52, the second forward turret, fired 3 seconds later. Mounts 53, 54, and 55, arrayed amidships and aft, followed in sequence. Johnston's 5 turrets could deliver 15 shells every 18 seconds when the crew hit their rhythm. The shells traced flat arcs toward the enemy column. Time of flight at 16,000 yards, approximately 25 seconds. Hagen watched for splashes, adjusting aim based on where rounds landed relative to the target. The first salvo fell short by 200 yards. Hagen corrected elevation. The second salvo landed over. The third salvo hit. 2 5-inch shells struck the forward superstructure of heavy cruiser Kumano at 7:07. The shells, armor-piercing rounds designed to penetrate deck plate and detonate inside the hull, struck glancing blows against Kumano's belt armor and detonated externally. Damage was minimal, 2 crewmen wounded, minor fires on the weather deck. 1 rangefinder optic shattered, but the effect was psychological. Kumano's captain, believing he faced a heavy cruiser or light cruiser at minimum, ordered a turn to port to unmask his after turrets. The maneuver opened a gap in the Japanese column. Evans saw the gap and adjusted course, aiming Johnston through the opening. If he could reach the far side of the enemy formation, he could launch torpedoes into their reverse course, forcing them to turn away from the carriers. Range: 10,800 yards. Hartigan requested permission to launch. Evans denied it. Another minute, another 1,000 yards. Johnston's 5-inch guns continued firing, now targeting the battleship Congo. The destroyer's fire was harassing, not damaging. 55-pound shells could not penetrate 16-inch armor, but it served the purpose. Congo's spotters lost their solution on the escort carriers behind the smoke and shifted to the immediate threat. Congo's forward turret, mounting 4 14-inch rifles, fired a 4-gun salvo at Johnston. The shells arrived in 8 seconds, faster than the destroyer could react. 2 shells landed directly ahead, throwing water across the bridge. 1 shell struck the water 50 feet from Johnston's bow and ricocheted into the air, tumbling end over end before splashing down 300 yards beyond. The 4th shell missed to starboard. Evans checked his watch. 7:08. Johnston had been under continuous fire for 9 minutes and had taken no direct hits. Probability and geometry would not favor them much longer. The destroyer could not outrun 18-inch shells. The only advantage was unpredictability, course changes, smoke, speed variations, and audacity. The Japanese expected American destroyers to screen defensively, not charge into gun range. Every second Johnston held their attention was another second. The escort carriers ran south, putting distance between themselves and center force. But distance was relative. Carrier Gambier Bay, the slowest of Taffy 3, reported 18 knots maximum. Japanese battleships could sustain 27. The math remained unforgiving. Hartigan called from the torpedo director. Tubes angled, solution locked. Range 9,200 yards. Time to target at 42 knots. 6 minutes, 30 seconds. Evans scanned the Japanese column. Congo held course, now angled slightly away. The cruiser Kumano continued her turn, presenting her beam. Perfect geometry. Evans gave the order. Johnston's torpedo mount swiveled, training the tubes toward the enemy. Hartigan initiated the firing sequence. Tube 1 fired with a hiss of compressed air. The Mark 15 torpedo, weighing 3,200 pounds, dropped into the sea and stabilized at a depth of 10 feet. Its gyroscope engaged. setting course toward the pre-calculated intercept point. Tubes 2 through 5 followed at 5-second intervals. 5 torpedoes entered the water, their wakes invisible in the chop, running cold and straight towards center force. Evans ordered hard left rudder. The instant the last torpedo cleared, Johnston heeled into the turn, the deck canting 30 degrees. Crewmen grabbed stanchions and railings. In the engine room, Ellsworth watched as pressure gauges fluctuated wildly. The sudden course change disrupted water flow to the condensers, momentarily spiking temperatures. He throttled back momentarily to prevent turbine damage, then pushed the throttles forward again as Johnston steadied on her new course. The destroyer had completed a 180-degree turn in 40 seconds, now running perpendicular to the enemy column, opening the range, laying more smoke. The torpedo run would take 6.5 minutes. During that time, Johnston had to survive. Congo fired again at 7:09. This salvo found the range. One 14-inch shell struck Johnston's stern, just aft of Mount 55. The shell, a 400-pound armor-piercing projectile designed to penetrate battleship deck armor, punched through Johnston's quarter-inch plating as if it were paper. It traveled through the after-crew berthing, through the after-engine room, and exited through the keel without detonating. The hole it left was 30 inches in diameter. Water flooded the after-engine room at a rate of 60 gallons per second. Ellsworth, in the forward engine room, saw his pressure drop as the after turbine lost power. He secured steam to the after plant to prevent scalding the crew and diverted all remaining steam to the forward turbine. Johnston's speed dropped from 35 knots to 28. In the after-engine room, water tender George Carbon and his team fought the flood. Seawater sprayed through the entry hole, driven by pressure and the ship's motion. Carbon activated the emergency bilge pumps, electric pumps capable of moving 150 gallons per minute. But the inflow exceeded capacity. He ordered the compartment evacuated and sealed. 6 men climbed the ladder to the main deck, Carbon last. He dogged the hatch behind him as water reached the lower platform. The after-engine room was lost, but the forward plant remained operational. Johnston could still make 28 knots on one turbine. The question was how long the forward plant could sustain that load before something failed. Evans assessed damage from the bridge. One engine room flooded, one torpedo mount inoperable, aft steering compartment taking water. The ship listed 3 degrees to starboard, correctable with counterflooding, but that would cost speed. He ordered no counterflooding. Speed mattered more than trim. Johnston continued her run parallel to the Japanese column, staying in the smoke, guns still firing. Hagen had shifted targets to the cruiser Haguro, which had turned to pursue. Haguro's 8-inch guns had longer range than Johnston's 5-inch, but the cruiser's fire control was less sophisticated. Haguro's salvos landed consistently behind Johnston, suggesting their spotters were misjudging the destroyer's speed. Hagen exploited the error, calling for rapid fire. Johnston's guns worked mechanically. Load, fire, eject, repeat. The crews in the turrets moved like automatons, each man executing his role without conscious thought. Shell cases piled on the deck. Powder residue stung eyes and throats. At 7:14, Johnston's torpedoes reached the enemy column. Hartigan watched through binoculars, searching for the telltale geyser of a hit. The first torpedo missed ahead of Congo. The battleship's speed was higher than estimated. The second torpedo ran under Congo's shallow draft without triggering its magnetic exploder, a proximity fuse designed to detonate beneath the ship's keel, breaking its back, but prone to premature detonation or failure. The third torpedo struck Kumano amidships on the starboard side. The explosion tore a 40-foot hole in the cruiser's hull, flooding 2 boiler rooms and jamming her rudder. Kumano slewed to starboard, out of formation, losing way. The fourth and fifth torpedoes missed wide, running beyond the formation into empty sea. 1 hit out of 5, a 20% success rate. But 1 hit was enough to remove a heavy cruiser from the battle. Kumano limped north at 12 knots. escorted by 2 destroyers detailed to assist. Centreforce's strength had diminished by 1/15. The psychological impact was greater. Admiral Kurita, on Yamato's bridge, saw Kumano's smoke and received reports of American heavy cruisers. Johnston's aggressive maneuvers and accurate fire suggested a ship larger than a destroyer. Kurita began to question his intelligence. If heavy cruisers were present, were battleships nearby? Was this a trap? The questions introduced hesitation. Centreforce's advance slowed from 27 knots to 23 as ships maneuvered to avoid potential torpedo spreads. Johnston had bought the carriers 5 minutes. 5 minutes translated to approximately 1.4 nautical miles of additional distance. The carriers used the time to launch every available aircraft, 36 Grumman FM-2 Wildcats, a lightweight variant of the F-4F fighter, designed for escort carrier operations, armed with 4 50-caliber machine guns, and capable of carrying 2 250-pound bombs and 21 Grumman TBM Avengers, torpedo bombers capable of carrying a 2,000-pound Mark 13 torpedo or 4 500-pound bombs. The aircraft were not equipped for fleet action. They carried anti-submarine ordnance and small bombs for ground support, but they could strafe, and they could draw attention. The Wildcats climbed to attack altitude and began runs on the Japanese column, their 50-caliber guns chewing into superstructures and unarmored deck spaces. The Avengers, lacking torpedoes, made dummy runs, forcing Japanese ships to maneuver. Kurita's formation spread further. The air attacks, though individually ineffective against armored warships, achieved cumulative psychological effect. Japanese anti-aircraft crews, already exhausted from continuous alerts during the approach through Sibuyan Sea, fired at every aircraft that approached. The volume of fire was impressive. Streams of tracers arcing across the sky, black puffs of heavy AA bursts, the occasional aircraft trailing smoke as it pulled away. But the accuracy was poor. Fatigued gunners misjudged lead angles. Disrupted fire control systems produced erratic solutions. Most shells burst far from their targets. The Wildcat and Avenger pilots exploited this, making shallow angle approaches that maximized the defenders' difficulty in tracking them. Lieutenant Commander Edward Huxtable, leading a 6-plane Wildcat division from carrier Callinan Bay, coordinated his attacks with Johnston's movements. Huxtable had monitored the destroyer's radio transmissions and recognized that Johnston was drawing disproportionate fire. He directed his division to strafe the cruisers engaging Johnston, not to sink them. .50 caliber rounds could not penetrate cruiser armor, but to disrupt their spotting and fire control. Huxtable's first run targeted Tone's fire control tower, his guns raking the open bridge where spotters stood with binoculars. The bullets killed 2 spotters and damaged optical equipment. Tone's next salvo, fired seconds after Huxtable's pass, missed Johnston by 400 yards, twice the previous missed distance. The correlation was clear. Huxtable repeated the tactic, making 3 more runs before his ammunition ran dry. The Avengers contributed differently. Unable to damage heavy units with their light bomb loads, they focused on psychological disruption. Lieutenant Junior Grade Joseph McGraw, piloting an Avenger from Gambia Bay, executed a simulated torpedo run on battleship Congo, approaching from an angle that suggested he carried a Mark 13 torpedo. He did not. His weapons load consisted of 4 250-pound general-purpose bombs, useless against a battleship. But Congo's captain could not know this. The battleship turned hard to port, presenting her stern to the apparent torpedo track, losing position in the column and forcing ships behind her to maneuver. McGraw dropped his bombs harmlessly into the sea and pulled away. The maneuver had cost Congo 3 minutes and disrupted the formation. McGraw repeated the tactic twice more before returning to his carrier, his fuel critically low. The combined effect of Johnston's gunfire and the air attacks created an environment of continuous threat that prevented Japanese ships from settling into effective firing solutions on the carriers. Each time a cruiser or battleship steadied on a carrier target, a destroyer appeared through the smoke-laying shells nearby, or an aircraft dove from altitude forcing evasive turns. The rhythm of threat, engage destroyer, evade aircraft, reacquire carrier, repeat, slowed center forces advance and degraded accuracy. Admiral Kurita, observing this pattern from Yamato, began to suspect he faced a larger force than initially assessed. Destroyers and aircraft suggested carrier groups plural, not the single group his intelligence had reported. The suspicion was false, but it was reasonable given the chaos of the tactical picture. Evans saw the aircraft overhead and recognized the opportunity. With the Japanese distracted, Johnston could extend her smokescreen, giving the carriers additional concealment. He ordered a course toward the enemy rear, intending to circle behind the Japanese column and re-engage from a new angle. The maneuver required crossing open water, no smoke, no concealment, for approximately 4 minutes. Hagen protested. 4 minutes under fire from multiple ships, guaranteed hits. Evans overruled him. Gambier Bay, the slowest carrier, was still in range of Japanese cruisers. If Johnston did not draw fire, Gambier Bay would sink within 15 minutes. Evans accepted the risk. Johnston cleared her own smokescreen at 7:18. Instantly 6 Japanese ships shifted fire to her. The bridge crew watched as muzzle flashes rippled along enemy hulls, cruiser 8-inch guns, destroyer 5-inch guns, even Yamato's secondary battery of 6-inch guns. The first salvo arrived in 12 seconds. 20 shells landed around Johnston, geysers erupting in a pattern that encircled the ship. Evans ordered evasive maneuvers, hard right rudder, then left, then right again, each turn executed before the enemy could adjust. The maneuver worked for 30 seconds. Then a shell from cruiser Haguro struck Johnston's bridge. The 8-inch shell hit the portside bulkhead at 7:19. It penetrated the quarter-inch steel, passed through the bridge's interior, and exited through the starboard side without detonating. The non-detonation saved the bridge crew's lives, but the shell's passage destroyed equipment and wounded men. Lieutenant Hagen took shrapnel in his left arm and face. The Mark 37 director's gyroscope shattered, rendering the fire control system inoperable. Hale, the trainer, was thrown against the bulkhead and suffered a broken collarbone. Evans remained standing, untouched, but the bridge was chaos. Smoke, blood, sparking wires, the smell of burning insulation. He moved to the backup conning station, a small armored compartment aft of the bridge with minimal instruments. From there he could see the stern but not the bow. He would have to con the ship by instinct, and reports from lookouts. Without the Mark 37 director, Johnston's guns shifted to local control. Each turret commander used his own optics and estimates to aim and fire. Accuracy degraded immediately. Shells that had been landing within 100 yards of targets now scattered across 500 yards, but the guns continued firing. Gun Captain Whelan in Mount 51 maintained a rhythm, 3 shells every 18 seconds until a Japanese shell struck the turret's base. The explosion jammed the training gear, locking the turret at a fixed bearing. Whelan's crew continued loading and firing straight ahead, hitting whatever crossed their arc. Mount 52 took over primary targeting, its commander, Chief Gunner's Mate Paul Vetter, estimating ranges by eye and calling corrections based on splash patterns. Johnston's speed had dropped to 24 knots. The forward turbine was overheating, pushed beyond its designed load. Ellsworth watched temperatures climb past red line into ranges where metal loses temper and components fail. He requested permission to reduce speed. Evans denied it. Every knot mattered. Ellsworth stayed at his post, monitoring gauges, adjusting steam flow, praying the turbine held together. Around him, the engine room crew worked in 120-degree heat, their faces slick with sweat, their hands blistered from touching hot metal. The noise was overwhelming, turbines screaming, pumps hammering, hull groaning under stress. They could hear impacts through the hull, sharp metallic clangs that indicated shells striking somewhere above. At 7:23, a salvo from Congo landed alongside Johnston's port side. One shell struck the waterline, buckling hull plates and opening a seam. Water flooded the forward fire room, dousing one boiler and forcing the crew to evacuate. Johnston's steam pressure dropped by 1/3. Ellsworth watched the gauges fall and adjusted flow to maintain pressure to the turbine, but the loss was irreversible. Speed dropped to 18 knots. Evans felt the change immediately. The vibration pattern altered. The bow dropped slightly. He knew what the numbers meant. At 18 knots, Johnston could not outrun Japanese destroyers, which could make 35. The pursuit had become a matter of time. But time was the objective. Each minute Johnston remained afloat was another minute. The carriers ran south. Evans checked his watch. 7:24. Johnston had been in action for 26 minutes. Gambier Bay had gained approximately 3 miles. Not enough. Japanese cruisers were beginning to land shells near her. Wildcats and Avengers still circled overhead, making attack runs, but their ammunition was running low. Within 10 minutes, the air cover would dissipate. Then it would be Johnston, 2 other destroyers, and 4 destroyer escorts against center force. The mathematics were unchanged. Impossible. Evans ordered the helm to steer toward the nearest Japanese destroyer, which had moved to cut off Johnston's escape route. The enemy ship Noaki-class, displacing 2,400 tons, slightly larger than Johnston, opened fire at 8,000 yards. Her 5-inch guns matched Johnston's, but Noaki had the advantage of undamaged fire control and full speed. Evans ordered return fire. Mount 52 engaged, firing as fast as the crew could load. Vetter aimed for the waterline, hoping to score a lucky hit that would slow the enemy. His 3rd salvo struck Noaki's forward turret, disabling 1 gun. The 4th salvo hit the bridge, killing the helm crew and jamming the rudder. Noaki turned in a circle, out of control, dropping back from the pursuit. Another enemy removed from the battle, but the cost was mounting. Johnston had expended 70% of her main battery ammunition. The 5-inch magazines held fewer than 200 rounds, enough for 15 minutes of sustained fire. After that, Johnston's guns would fall silent. The secondary battery, 40 mm Bofors and 20 mm Ophelican autocannons, remained fully armed but were useless beyond 4,000 yards. Evans did the arithmetic. 15 minutes of ammunition, 18 knots of speed, multiple enemy ships converging. Johnston would not survive another quarter hour, but she did not need to survive. She needed to be dangerous long enough that the Japanese could not ignore her. At 7:31, Evans addressed the crew over the ship's public address system. His voice, amplified through speakers in every compartment, cut through the noise of battle. He told them Gambier Bay was still afloat. He told them every enemy ship focusing on Johnston was one less ship firing at the carriers. He told them they had done the job they were trained to do. He did not tell them the situation was hopeless. They already knew. Evans switched off the microphone and returned his attention to the battle. 2 heavy cruisers, Tone and Chikuma, had broken from the main column and were closing on Johnston's starboard quarter, range 12,000 yards and dropping rapidly. Their 8-inch guns had the reach and weight to finish Johnston in a single salvo. The crew's reaction to Evans's announcement varied by station. In the magazines, where men could not see the battle, the words provided context. They were not dying for nothing. The carriers lived because Johnston fought. On the gun mounts, where crews watched Japanese ships close, the words offered slim reassurance. Yes, they had done their job, but the job was killing them. In the engine spaces where Ellsworth and his team fought to maintain power against cascading failures, the words were background noise. They had their own fight, keeping the turbine turning, managing steam pressure, preventing catastrophic boiler failure. Ellsworth's universe was 10 gauges, 4 valves and 2 throttles. Nothing beyond that mattered until the turbine stopped or the compartment flooded. The damage to Johnston's propulsion system had reached critical thresholds. With the after turbine destroyed and one boiler flooded, the forward plant was operating at 140% of design capacity. The turbine blades, spinning at 4,200 revolutions per minute, were flexing under centrifugal loads they were never designed to sustain. Ellsworth monitored turbine bearing temperatures, watching them climb past red line into the danger zone where metal begins to soften. At 680 degrees Fahrenheit, 50 degrees above maximum rated temperature, bearing material would deform, causing catastrophic seizure. Ellsworth's gauges read 665 degrees and rising. He had perhaps 10 minutes before the bearing failed, maybe 15 if he reduced throttle. But reducing throttle meant losing speed, and speed was survival. He held the throttles at maximum and watched the temperature climb. The flooding situation forward had stabilized at a precarious equilibrium. The forward fire room had flooded completely. The after engine room was sealed with water to the overhead, and the forward engine room, Ellsworth Station, had taken water from near-miss shell splashes, but remained operational. Damage Control Party 1 had shored the bulkhead separating the flooded compartments from the remaining dry spaces. The shoring consisted of timber beams wedged horizontally against the bulkheads, distributing pressure across the weakened plates. Chief Novak inspected each shore, tapping it with a mallet to test its hold. A properly set shore rang with a solid thump. A loose shore produced a hollow sound. Novak found 3 loose shores and reset them, driving wedges deeper with hammer blows that echoed through the hull. The list to starboard had increased to 12 degrees. Johnston's hull, designed to float level, was out of trim. The starboard main deck was 6 feet lower than the port side. This affected everything. Gunnery solutions were calculated assuming level firing. Ammunition hoists operated with less efficiency when tilted. Even walking across the deck required conscious adjustment. Sailors moved with one hand on railings, compensating for the cant. The list also affected shell impacts. Shells landing to starboard hit the hull at steeper angles, increasing penetration. Shells landing to port struck at shallower angles, sometimes glancing off. The difference was marginal, but measurable. Damage control teams prioritized shoring starboard side compartments, knowing they were more vulnerable. Johnston's situation at 7:32 could be quantified in diminishing resources. Main battery ammunition, 180 rounds remaining across all operational turrets. Secondary battery ammunition, 40 rounds exhausted, 20 rounds at 12%. Fuel sufficient for 6 hours at current consumption, but current consumption assumed an operational engine room which no longer applied. Electrical power, main generators operating at 70% capacity due to damaged switchboards. Fresh water, contaminated with seawater in all but 2 tanks. Food irrelevant. The crew had not eaten since 6 o'clock before battle stations, and would not eat again aboard Johnston. Medical supplies, morphine depleted, bandages nearly exhausted, plasma expended treating shock victims. The ship was consuming itself, burning through every reserve to buy additional minutes. Evans ordered all remaining smoke canisters activated. White clouds billowed from Johnston's deck, adding to the stack's smoke. The screen was thin. Johnston's speed was too low to lay effective concealment, but it disrupted Japanese optics momentarily. Tone and Chikuma fired into the smoke, shells landing close but missing. Evans steered erratically, turning into and out of the smoke, making his position ambiguous. The tactic bought 2 minutes. At 7:33, a shell from Tone struck Johnston's stack, severing it at the base. The stack toppled forward, crashing onto the deck and crushing the after-deck house. Steam vented from broken pipes, scalding 2 crewmen. Johnston's smoke generation ceased. The destroyer ran naked under the enemy's guns. The stack's collapse had secondary effects beyond the loss of smoke generation. The stack carried exhaust from the boilers. Without it, exhaust pressure built up in the fire room, reducing combustion efficiency. Ellsworth felt the pressure drop across his steam lines and compensated by increasing oil flow to the remaining boiler, but increased oil consumption meant reduced operating time. He calculated quickly, at current consumption, fuel would last 3 hours, not 6. 3 hours was optimistic. It assumed Johnston survived that long. Ellsworth dismissed the calculation and focused on maintaining steam pressure. Long-term fuel consumption was irrelevant when the ship might sink in the next 5 minutes. The crew working topside had to navigate around the fallen stack, which lay diagonally across the main deck, blocking access to the after section. Damage control teams rigged lines and ladders to bypass the obstruction, but movement aft was slowed. This complicated medical evacuation, wounded men in the after section could not be carried forward to the main aid station. Pharmacist's mate Smith adapted by establishing a secondary aid station on the fantail, treating men with whatever supplies remained. He performed amputations with a bone saw from the ship's carpenter shop, administered local anesthetic salvaged from dental supplies, and stitched wounds with fishing line when surgical thread ran out. His methods were improvised and crude, but they saved lives that would otherwise have been lost to shock and blood loss. Johnston's tactical value at this stage was proportional to her threat perception. She was visibly damaged. List, smoke, reduced speed, but still firing, still maneuvering, still dangerous. Japanese captains had to assess whether Johnston was effectively neutralized or still posed a threat requiring active engagement. The assessment was binary. If neutralized, ignore her and engage the carriers. If threatening, continue firing until she sinks. Johnston's guns made the decision for them. As long as her turrets fired, as long as shells landed near Japanese ships, she could not be ignored. Evans understood this calculus and ordered sustained fire, even when ammunition was critically low. 10 shells per minute across 3 turrets meant 30 shells per minute, enough to keep Japanese spotters tracking her. The loss of the Mark 37 Director had cascading effects on gunnery effectiveness. Without centralized fire control, each turret operated independently, selecting targets based on local observation. This eliminated coordinated salvos, where multiple turrets fired at the same target simultaneously, increasing probability of hits. Independent fire meant each turret engaged different targets, spreading damage but reducing lethality. Vetter in Mount 52 targeted Tone, Sullivan in Mount 54 targeted Chickamauga, Whelan in Mount 51, constrained by his jammed training gear, engaged whatever crossed his fixed arc. The result was harassment across multiple enemy ships, but no concentrated fire. It was enough to maintain threat perception but insufficient to sink anything. Radio discipline had broken down across the American formation. The task force radio net, intended for coordinated tactical communication, had devolved into a cacophony of damage reports, calls for assistance, and contradictory orders. Johnston's radio, when it functioned, caught fragments, Gambier Bay taking hits, Hole dead in the water, air strike inbound friendly. The information was useful but incomplete. Evans could not build a coherent picture of the broader battle from the radio fragments. He relied instead on visual observation and inference. He saw smoke plumes from sinking ships. American or Japanese he could not tell at this distance. He saw aircraft overhead, their profiles identifying them as Wildcats and Avengers. He saw Japanese ships maneuvering, their formations disrupted. From these observations he inferred that the American defense was holding, barely, and that Johnston's continued resistance contributed to that hold. The crew's physical state had deteriorated measurably. Men had been at battle stations for 45 minutes under continuous stress. Adrenaline sustained them initially, but adrenaline depletes, leaving exhaustion. Gunners' arms ached from repetitive motion. Ram, load, fire, repeat. Magazine loaders gasped for air in poorly ventilated compartments filled with powder smoke. Engine room crew worked in 130-degree heat, their coveralls soaked with sweat, their vision blurred by dehydration. Topside crews shivered despite exertion. Spray and wind chilled them, and the Pacific, even in tropical latitudes, runs cold at depth. The physiological toll compounded the psychological. Exhausted men make errors, and errors in combat are fatal. Yet, the errors did not come. Training, drilled until reflexive, compensated for fatigue. Men performed their tasks correctly because they had performed them thousands of times in practice. Muscle memory overrode conscious thought. Gorski in the magazine handed shells at the correct rhythm without counting seconds. Kowalski in the handling room cranked the hoist without checking his form. Welson's crew in the turret loaded and fired without Welson's cadence. They no longer needed it. The training Evans had imposed during Johnston's shakedown, the relentless drills, the night exercises, the emphasis on doing the job until you could do it blind, paid its dividend now, when men worked blind and exhausted and still did the job correctly. Evans ordered all remaining smoke canisters activated. White clouds billowed from Johnston's deck, adding to the stack smoke. The screen was thin. Johnston's speed was too low to lay effective concealment, but it disrupted Japanese optics momentarily. Tone and Chikuma fired into the smoke, shells landing close but missing. Evans steered erratically, turning into and out of the smoke, making his position ambiguous. The tactic bought 2 minutes. At 7:33, a shell from Tone struck Johnston's stack, severing it at the base. The stack toppled forward, crashing onto the deck and crushing the after-deck house. Steam vented from broken pipes, scalding 2 crewmen. Johnston's smoke generation ceased. The destroyer ran naked under the enemy's guns. The next salvo hit amidships. 2 8-inch shells struck Mount 53, the amidships turret. 1 shell penetrated the turret's thin armor and detonated inside, killing the 6-man crew instantly. The explosion blew the turret's roof off, flinging it into the sea. The second shell struck the deck beneath the turret and ruptured fuel lines. Burning oil spread across the deck, igniting ammunition stores in the nearby handling room. The fire reached 5-inch powder cases, which exploded in sequence, blowing a 20-foot hole in the deck. Johnston listed 10 degrees to starboard. Damage control teams flooded the magazine to prevent a larger explosion, but the ship was hemorrhaging buoyancy. Evans assessed the situation. 3 of 5 main battery turrets destroyed or disabled, 1 engine room flooded, 1 boiler out, speed 16 knots and falling, list 10 degrees and worsening. Hull integrity compromised in 4 compartments, time remaining, minutes. He could order abandon ship and save most of the crew, or he could continue engaging, drawing fire, giving the carriers additional seconds. He chose the latter. The decision was not rational. It was instinctive, rooted in a principle he had articulated when Johnston was commissioned 18 months earlier. This would be a fighting ship. She would fight until she could not. Mount 51, the forward turret, continued firing. The turret's training gear was jammed, locking it at a fixed bearing, but the crew loaded and fired mechanically, hitting anything that crossed their arc. Whelan, the gun captain, had lost track of rounds expended. He ordered the crew to keep loading until the magazine ran dry. Below, in the magazine, loaders passed shells hand to hand, the compartment's lights flickering as electrical systems failed. They worked in near darkness, guided by muscle memory and the sound of the turret's recoil. One loader, Seaman Michael Gorski, counted shells as they passed. 43, 42, 41. At 20 rounds remaining, he called up to Whelan. Whelan acknowledged and adjusted his targets, prioritizing the nearest threat. The ammunition logistics were critical. Each 5-inch shell weighed 55 pounds, 25 pounds of projectile, 30 pounds of powder case. A trained loader could move 1 shell every 8 seconds from magazine to hoist. The magazine to gun path involved 3 transfer points: magazine to lower hoist to upper handling room to gun. At each point a man waited to receive and pass the shell. The system was designed for sustained fire rates of 15 rounds per minute per gun, but sustained fire assumed undamaged equipment and rested crews. Johnston's crews had been at battle stations for 38 minutes. Fatigue was setting in. Gorski noticed the slowing shells that had moved every 8 seconds now took 10, then 12. He compensated by anticipating the next man's reach, positioning shells before they were called for. The technique maintained rhythm. In the upper handling room, directly beneath Mount 51, gunner's mate 3rd Class Raymond Kowalski managed the final transfer point. His job was to load shells into the hoist that carried them the last 15 feet into the turret. The hoist was electric, powered by a motor that drew current from Johnston's main generators. As battle damage accumulated, voltage fluctuated. The hoist stuttered, stopped, restarted. Kowalski learned to time his loading for moments when power was stable. When power failed completely, he hand-cranked the hoist, turning a wheel that raised the shell mechanically. Hand cranking took 30 seconds per shell versus 3 seconds with power. The difference was the gap between maintaining fire and going silent. Kowalski cranked until his shoulders burned, then cranked more. Above, in the turret itself, Whelan's crew functioned as a 6-man machine. The pointer controlled elevation, the trainer controlled bearing, the rammerman shoved shells into the breech. The powderman followed with the powder case, the breechman closed the block, and Whelan commanded. Each man's action triggered the next man's response. The sequence was drilled until it became reflexive. When a shell landed close, throwing the ship violently, the crew maintained their rhythm because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant fear. Reflexive action suppressed fear. Whelan understood this, and called cadence. Ram, powder, close fire, keeping the crew synchronized. The cadence was not necessary for trained gunners, but it filled the silence between explosions with something human. Johnston's remaining operational turrets, Mounts 52 and 54, continued engaging targets across a widening arc. Mount 52, under Chief Gunner's mate Paul Vetter, had shifted to counter-battery fire, targeting Japanese destroyers that were attempting to close for torpedo attacks. Vetter's crew achieved a hit on destroyer Urikaze at 7:28, the 5-inch shell striking the Japanese ship's after-funnel and disabling her engineering plant. Urikaze lost way, falling behind the Japanese formation. The hit was fortuitous. Vetter had been aiming at Urikaze's bridge and missed low. The shell struck the funnel by accident, but the effect was intentional, another enemy ship removed from pursuit. Mount 54, the after turret still operational despite damage to surrounding structures, engaged heavy cruiser tone under local control. Fire controlman James Sullivan, directing the turret from a position on the weather deck with binoculars and a handheld radio, estimated ranges and called corrections. Sullivan had no fire control computer, no rangefinder, only experience and geometry. He watched where shells landed, estimated the error in yards, calculated the correction in mils and angular measurement used in gunnery, where 1 mil equals 1 yard of deviation at 1,000 yards distance, and called the adjustment to the turret. His estimates were crude but workable. Mount 54's shells began landing within 500 yards of tone, close enough to force the cruiser to maneuver, which disrupted her own fire control solutions. The Japanese, for their part, were adapting to Johnston's tactics. Tone's captain ordered his ship to ignore the destroyer and focus on the escort carriers. Tone turned away from Johnston, opening the range, and shifted fire to carrier Kalinin Bay. The move was tactically sound. Carriers were the strategic objective, destroyers were obstacles, but the shift gave Johnston a reprieve. For 90 seconds, no shells landed near her. The crew used the time to address damage, shoring bulkheads, fighting fires, treating wounded. Damage Control Party 3, led by Chief Carpenter's mate Andrew Novak, worked in the forward section where flooding from near misses had buckled hull plates. Novak's team used wooden beams to shore the bulkhead, wedging them between the weakened plate and the opposite bulkhead. The shoring would not stop catastrophic flooding if the plate gave way, but it reduced the leak rate to something the bilge pumps could manage. Novak worked in knee-deep water, his hands numb from cold, his ears ringing from explosions. He positioned each beam by feel, testing its hold, then moved to the next weak point. The tactical situation at 7:29 showed Johnston isolated from the other American destroyers. Hull had turned north, engaging Congo with torpedoes. Heermann had circled east, laying smoke to screen the carriers. The destroyer escorts Samuel B. Roberts, Dennis, Raymond, and John C. Butler were scattered across a 10-mile radius, each engaging opportunistically. Johnston fought alone, visible to multiple enemy ships, absorbing fire that would otherwise target the carriers. The mathematics of attention were simple. Each ship firing at Johnston was one less ship firing at the carriers. Evans did not need to sink enemy ships. He needed to be threatening enough that they could not ignore him. He achieved this by closing range and maintaining accurate fire. Japanese captains, observing Johnston's shells landing near their ships, concluded the destroyer had competent fire control and posed a real threat. They prioritized her accordingly. Kurita, on Yamato's bridge, received conflicting reports. Some observers claimed the attacking ships were destroyers. Others insisted they were cruisers based on aggressive behavior and accurate gunnery. Kurita had no reconnaissance aircraft. His float planes had been damaged in earlier engagements, so he relied on visual identification, which was unreliable in the smoke and spray. He erred toward caution, assuming the larger estimate. If American cruisers were present, American battleships might be nearby. The logic was flawed. No battleships were within 300 miles, but Kurita could not confirm this. His decision-making reflected incomplete information, the fog of war in its literal form. Johnston's communication systems had degraded significantly. The primary radio transmitter, located in the aft deckhouse, had been destroyed when Tone's shell severed the stack. The backup transmitter, in the forward deckhouse, was operational but intermittent due to electrical faults. Radioman First-class Eugene Foss worked to maintain contact with the carrier group, relaying damage reports and receiving targeting information. Foss operated with a handheld microphone and a receiver jury-rigged from spare parts. His transmissions were fragmented. Johnston, heavy damage, still engaging, estimate 20 minutes, but sufficient to inform the task group commander that Johnston remained in the fight. The commander, aboard carrier Fanshawe Bay, used this information to coordinate airstrikes, directing aircraft to targets Johnston had engaged but not sunk. The coordination multiplied effectiveness. Johnston damaged, aircraft finished. The crew's morale, despite catastrophic circumstances, remained functional. This was not enthusiasm. No one believed they would survive, but rather grim determination. The men had accepted the situation and focused on their immediate tasks. In the forward magazine, Gorski counted shells. In the handling room, Kowalski cranked the hoist. On the gun mounts, loaders rammed shells into breaches. Each man's world had contracted to the square footage of his station and the task in his hands. The broader battle, the sinking ship, the overwhelming enemy, the probable death existed in peripheral awareness, but did not dominate conscious thought. This psychological compartmentalization, though fragile, allowed continued function under stress that would otherwise paralyze. Evans, conning from the backup station with minimal instruments, relied on reports from lookouts and officers scattered across the ship. He received updates via sound-powered phone, a communication system that required no electrical power, using only the acoustic energy of the speaker's voice to vibrate a diaphragm connected by wire to a receiver. The reports were terse. Mount 51 40 rounds remaining. Flooding in frame 63 contained steering responding. Evans processed each report, updating his mental model of Johnston's capabilities. He knew the ship was dying. The list, the slowing, the progressive loss of systems told him that. But dying took time, and time was the commodity he was selling. Every minute Johnston remained combat capable was another minute for the carriers. He would spend every minute available. That threat was Chikuma, closing to 6,000 yards. The heavy cruiser had Johnston bracketed, her spotters correcting with each salvo. At 7:37, Chikuma landed 2 shells in quick succession. One struck Johnston's forward fire room, penetrating the deck and detonating among the boilers. The explosion ruptured steam lines and blew a hole in the hull below the waterline. The fire room flooded in seconds. The second shell hit the forward engine room, Ellsworth Station. The shell passed through the overhead and detonated on the turbine casing. Shrapnel filled the compartment. Ellsworth was killed instantly, along with 4 of his crew. The forward turbine seized, its bearings destroyed. Johnston's screws stopped turning. She coasted to a halt, dead in the water at 7:38. Evans ordered "abandon ship" at 7:39. Crewmen moved to the weather decks, preparing life rafts and flotation devices. Many men were wounded: burns, shrapnel, blast injuries. Pharmacists mate Bill Smith and his team did what they could with the supplies remaining, but morphine and bandages were running low. Smith worked on the main deck, exposed to fire, treating men as shells landed around them. One shell struck 50 feet away, throwing fragments across the deck. Smith took shrapnel in his leg but continued working, wrapping wounds, administering morphine syrettes, helping men into rafts. He did not stop until he had treated every wounded man within reach. Johnston's guns fell silent at 7:41. Mount 51 fired its last shell, a round that arced toward Chikuma and missed by 200 yards, and the turret crew secured the breach. No ammunition remained. The secondary battery had ceased firing minutes earlier, its 40 mm and 20 mm rounds exhausted in continuous anti-aircraft fire against strafing attacks. Johnston floated without power, without steam, listing 15 degrees and settling by the stern. The Japanese closed in, shells landing closer with each salvo. A destroyer, Asakaze, approached to within 2,000 yards, her guns trained on Johnston's hull, preparing to administer the final blow. Evans stood on the bridge wing, watching his crew abandon ship. Life rafts dotted the water, men swimming away from the sinking destroyer. He had no intention of leaving. A commander did not abandon his ship while it remained afloat. Executive Officer Hagen, wounded but mobile, climbed to the bridge and found Evans. Hagen argued. Evans refused. The ship was going down, Hagen said. Evans knew. The captain's place, Evans replied, was on the bridge. Hagen protested further, but Evans ordered him off the ship. Hagen obeyed, reluctantly, climbing down to the main deck and stepping into the water. He swam toward a raft, looking back once. Evans stood alone on the bridge, a silhouette against the smoke and flames. At 7:45, Asakaze fired a final salvo. 4 5-inch shells struck Johnston's hull at the waterline. The explosions opened the seams, and the sea rushed in. Johnston rolled to starboard, the list increasing to 30 degrees, then 45. Water flooded the main deck. The bow lifted as the stern sank, the destroyer standing nearly vertical for a moment, before sliding beneath the surface. She disappeared at 7:50, 73 minutes after the first enemy shell landed. The men in the rafts watched her go. Some saluted, others wept. Most simply held on to the rafts and waited for rescue. Rescue came 20 hours later. Destroyer escort USS Samuel Ben Roberts and destroyer Heermann returned to search for survivors after Centerforce withdrew. They found 141 men from Johnston's crew of 327. Commander Evans was not among them. Witnesses reported he had remained on the bridge as the ship sank. His body was never recovered. The Navy awarded him the Medal of Honor posthumously, the first Native American naval officer to receive the decoration. The citation noted his aggressive leadership and refusal to yield against overwhelming force. The tactical outcome was measurable. Johnston sank, but her torpedo hit removed heavy cruiser Kumano from the battle. Her gunfire damaged destroyer Naoki and disrupted the formation of center force. Her smokescreens gave escort carriers Gambia Bay, Kalinin Bay, and Fanshawe Bay additional time to escape, though Gambia Bay eventually succumbed to cruiser fire. More importantly, Johnston's charge and the subsequent attacks by destroyers Hole and Harriman convinced Admiral Kurita that he faced a stronger force than intelligence suggested. Kurita withdrew center force at 9:20, breaking off the attack. Taffy 3's remaining carriers survived. The invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf remained intact. Historians later calculated that Johnston's 73-minute action delayed center force's advance by approximately 8 nautical miles. 8 miles translated to 24 additional minutes for the carriers to escape and reposition. 24 minutes allowed American aircraft to rearm and launch a second wave of attacks. The cumulative effect disrupted Kurita's timeline sufficiently that he believed he had missed his opportunity. He retreated through San Bernardino Strait, convinced he had faced heavy cruisers and possibly battleships. He never learned the truth. The ships that stopped center force displaced, collectively, less than a single Yamato-class battleship. Johnston's wreck was located in 2019 by undersea explorer Victor Vescovo, resting in 20,400 feet of water off Samar Island. The wreck showed extensive battle damage, multiple shell penetrations, collapsed superstructure, the severed stack lying on the deck. The bow section remained largely intact. The hull number, 557, still visible. Vescovo's team photographed the wreck and withdrew, leaving it undisturbed as a war grave. Subsequent analysis confirmed the wreck's identity through comparison with Johnston's construction plans. The discovery renewed interest in the Battle off Samar, prompting historical reviews and veteran interviews. The tactical lessons from Johnston's action entered U.S. Navy doctrine within months. Destroyer tactics shifted toward aggressive engagement, prioritizing disruption over survival. The concept of charge into the enemy became standard training for destroyer captains facing superior forces. The logic was counterintuitive but effective. An aggressive destroyer created uncertainty, forced enemy formations to maneuver, and divided attention among multiple threats. Even if the destroyer was sunk, the disruption often achieved strategic objectives. Johnston proved the doctrine viable. The human element, Evans' decision to charge alone, without waiting for coordinated squadron orders, sparked debate. Some naval theorists argued Evans violated doctrine by acting independently. Others countered that doctrine assumed time for coordination which did not exist at Samar. Evans made the decision most destroyer captains would hesitate to make, accepting certain destruction to buy uncertain time. The mathematics supported him. If Johnston had screened defensively, center force would have reached the carriers 6 minutes sooner. 6 minutes was the difference between Gambia Bay surviving long enough to launch aircraft and being sunk outright. 6 minutes mattered. Evans' background contributed to his decision-making. The son of a Cherokee father and a white mother, he had faced prejudice throughout his naval career, but had risen to command through competence and determination. He told his crew at commissioning that he intended to prove himself, to demonstrate that a Native American officer could command as well as anyone. Johnston's action was not about proving ethnic worth. That notion itself was a product of the prejudice he faced, but about executing the mission without hesitation. Evans did not calculate the odds, because the odds were irrelevant. The mission was protect the carriers. The method was engage the enemy. He executed both. The crew's performance reflected Evans' leadership. Johnston's damage control teams worked under fire until compartments flooded beyond saving. Gunners maintained their rhythm through ammunition exhaustion. Engine room crews pushed equipment past failure points. No one abandoned their post until Evans gave the order. The cohesion was not accidental. Evans had drilled the crew relentlessly during Johnston's shakedown and operational deployments. He emphasized cross-training. Every man could perform multiple roles and rehearse damage control scenarios until the crew could execute them in darkness and smoke. The training paid dividends when Johnston took her first hit. The crew responded automatically, without panic, focusing on damage containment and maintaining combat capability. The comparison between Johnston and the Japanese ships she engaged revealed asymmetries in doctrine and design. Japanese heavy cruisers and battleships prioritized firepower and armor, accepting reduced maneuverability. American destroyers prioritized speed and agility, accepting vulnerability. The trade-offs created a tactical imbalance. Japanese ships could absorb punishment but struggled to track fast-moving targets. American destroyers could maneuver rapidly but could not survive direct hits. Johnston exploited her strengths, speed, smoke, rapid course changes to maximize survival time. When those strengths eroded, speed lost to battle damage, smoke depleted, the imbalance reasserted. Johnston's sinking was inevitable once she lost mobility, but the time she bought was sufficient. The psychological impact on center force was significant. Kurita's decision to withdraw remains debated. Some historians attribute it to fuel concerns. Center force had burned considerable fuel during high-speed maneuvering. Others cite aircraft attacks, which, though ineffective in sinking ships, disrupted formations and inflicted casualties. A minority view holds that Kurita, exhausted after 72 hours of continuous operations, made a risk-averse decision influenced by incomplete intelligence. Johnston's role in shaping that intelligence is clear. Her aggressive attack suggested American surface forces were present in strength. Kurita had no way to verify otherwise. His retreat was cautious, perhaps overly so, but rational given his information. The broader strategic context of the Battle off Samar underscores Johnston's significance. The Japanese objective was to disrupt the Leyte Gulf invasion by destroying the vulnerable escort carriers providing air cover for ground forces. Success would have imperiled the entire Philippine campaign, potentially extending the war by months. The escort carriers' survival ensured continuous air support for troops ashore and maintained pressure on Japanese defensive positions. Johnston's action, combined with those of other destroyers and destroyer escorts, prevented the strategic failure that Japanese planners anticipated. The battle demonstrated that small ships, aggressively handled, could achieve effects disproportionate to their size. The cost to Johnston's crew was severe. Of 327 men aboard, 186 were lost, killed in action or drowned during the 20-hour wait for rescue. Many survivors suffered injuries that required extended hospitalization. Some never fully recovered. The psychological toll was equally significant. Survivors reported nightmares, survivors' guilt, and difficulty adjusting to post-war life. The Navy provided limited mental health support in 1944. The concept of post-traumatic stress disorder had not yet entered medical terminology. Survivors coped as best they could, often relying on each other for support. Annual reunions became a tradition, providing a space where survivors could share experiences with those who understood. The official recognition Johnston received came incrementally over the years immediately following the battle. Evans received the Medal of Honor posthumously in 1945. The ship received the Presidential Unit Citation in 1946. Individual decorations, Navy Crosses, Silver Stars, Bronze Stars followed over subsequent years. Modern analysis of Johnston's action benefits from recovered Japanese records, which provide insight into Center Force's perspective. Admiral Kurita's action report, declassified in the 1970s, described encountering heavy American forces, including cruisers and possibly battleships. He noted aggressive torpedo attacks and accurate gunfire that suggested professional training and superior fire control. He did not mention destroyers specifically, indicating his spotters misidentified Johnston and her sisters as larger vessels. The misidentification was understandable. Johnston's behavior resembled a heavy cruiser more than a destroyer. Heavy cruisers charged into gun range and traded salvos. Destroyers screened and harassed. Johnston did both, confusing enemy assessments. The technical performance of Johnston's weapons and systems during the battle has been studied extensively. The Mark 15 torpedo achieved a 20% hit rate, one hit from 5 launches, which aligned with wartime averages. Torpedo reliability remained problematic throughout the Pacific War, with depth-keeping issues, premature explosions, and dud warheads plaguing the weapon system. Johnston's crew had mitigated some issues through meticulous maintenance, but inherent design flaws remained unfixed. The Mark 37 fire control director, before its destruction, performed admirably, enabling Johnston to score hits at ranges exceeding 15,000 yards. The system's analog computers compensated for ship motion, target motion, and ballistic variables with surprising accuracy. Its loss forced Johnston's gunners to rely on visual estimates, reducing accuracy but not entirely eliminating effectiveness. The structural damage Johnston sustained illustrated both the Fletcher-class design's strengths and weaknesses. The ships were built light, using quarter-inch plating for most of the hull and half-inch plating for critical areas. This saved weight, enabling higher speeds and heavier armament, but provided minimal protection against even destroyer-caliber shells. Johnston took multiple hits from 8-inch and larger shells, any one of which could have been fatal. That she remained afloat for 73 minutes, despite catastrophic damage, speaks to effective compartmentalization and damage control. Each compartment could be sealed independently, limiting flooding. The crew exploited this feature, sealing compartments as they flooded and shifting weight to maintain trim. The technique extended Johnston's life by critical minutes. The decision to fight Johnston to the point of sinking, rather than disengaging when damage became irreversible, raises ethical questions about command responsibility. A captain's duty includes preserving his crew's lives. Evans prioritized mission over survival, a choice that resulted in 186 deaths. Naval ethicists have debated this decision for decades. The consensus view holds that Evans acted appropriately given the strategic stakes. The carrier's survival justified the risk. Had Evans disengaged, center force would have reached the carriers sooner, likely sinking all 6. The loss of 6 carriers and their crews, totaling over 5,000 men, would have vastly exceeded Johnston's casualties. The calculus was brutal but defensible. The individual stories of Johnston's crew add human texture to the tactical narrative. Chief Machinist's mate Harold Ellsworth, killed when the forward engine room was hit, had extended his enlistment specifically to serve on Johnston. His family received his posthumous Navy Cross at a ceremony in 1946. Pharmacist's mate Bill Smith, who treated wounded men while under fire, survived and returned to civilian life as a physician. He practiced in rural Oklahoma for 40 years, rarely speaking of his wartime service. Gun Captain Thomas Whelan, who kept Mount 51 firing until ammunition ran out, was rescued after 19 hours in the water. He suffered severe sunburn and dehydration, but recovered and remained in the Navy until retirement in 1962. Each man's story reflects a common thread. They did their job under impossible conditions because that was what was expected. Johnston's legacy extends beyond her individual action. The battle off Samar, and Johnston's role in it, influenced post-war destroyer design and doctrine. The Fletcher-class had proven effective but vulnerable. Subsequent destroyer classes, Sumner and Gearing, incorporated additional armor, improved compartmentalization, and redundant systems to enhance survivability. Tactical doctrine evolved to emphasize coordinated attacks, reducing reliance on individual ships charging alone. The lessons were codified in training manuals and war college curricula, shaping naval thinking for decades. Modern destroyer captains study Samar as a case study in audacity, resource management, and decision-making under pressure. The wreck's discovery in 2019 provided closure for some survivors and descendants. Photographs of the wreck showed Johnston resting upright on the seabed, her bow pointed north, her stern collapsed but recognizable. The hull number 557 remained visible, confirming identity beyond doubt. The Discovery team noted the wreck's depth, 20,400 feet deeper than Titanic, and the technical challenges of imaging it. The expedition used a deep submergence vehicle equipped with sonar and cameras, conducting multiple dives to map the site. The team treated the wreck as a war grave, avoiding disturbance and limiting artifact recovery to photographs. The images were shared with naval historians and Johnston survivors, several of whom were still alive in 2019. The comparison between Johnston's action and other famous last stands, Thermopylae, the Alamo, Rorke's Drift, invites analysis of why certain battles resonate culturally. Johnston's crew, like the defenders of those earlier battles, faced overwhelming odds and fought anyway. The outcome was never in doubt. Survival was not the objective. What mattered was the time bought, the enemy delayed, the mission accomplished at irreplaceable cost. These stories persist because they validate a principle that courage and determination can alter outcomes even when logic suggests futility. Whether this principle is inspirational or tragic depends on perspective. For the escort carrier crews who survived because Johnston bought them time, it was both. The technical details of Johnston's sinking, the sequence of hits, the progressive flooding, the loss of power, have been reconstructed through survivor testimony and analysis of the wreck. The after engine room flooded first, reducing speed but not stopping the ship. The forward fire room flooded next, cutting steam pressure by 1/3 and further reducing speed. The forward engine room flooded last, destroying the remaining turbine and stopping the ship entirely. The sequence took 49 minutes, during which Johnston maintained combat operations. The crew's ability to keep fighting while the ship disintegrated beneath them demonstrated training, discipline, and a commitment that transcended self-preservation. Evans' final moments remain uncertain. Some survivors reported seeing him on the bridge as Johnston sank. Others recalled him moving between stations, checking on the crew, ensuring orderly abandoned ship procedures. No definitive account exists. What is known is that Evans did not leave the ship. Whether he chose to stay or was unable to leave due to injury remains unclear. The ambiguity does not diminish his actions. He commanded Johnston through 73 minutes of combat, making decisions that saved carriers and thousands of lives. His presence on the bridge as the ship sank was consistent with naval tradition and personal character. He had promised Johnston would be a fighting ship. She was, until the sea claimed her. The aftermath of the Battle off Samar saw recriminations and questions. Why had Admiral Halsey taken his battleships north, leaving San Bernardino Strait unguarded? Why had Kurita withdrawn when victory seemed assured? These questions occupied naval analysts for years. Johnston's role in the battle was not immediately recognized. Early reports focused on the carriers and air attacks. Destroyer actions received less attention, partly because many destroyers sank and their crews were scattered. As records were compiled and survivors interviewed, Johnston's contribution became clearer. By the 1950s, naval historians recognized Samar as one of the most significant surface actions of the Pacific War, with Johnston as its exemplar. The evolution of naval warfare since 1944 has made actions like Johnston's less feasible. Modern destroyers rely on missiles, not guns and torpedoes. Engagements occur at distances measured in dozens or hundreds of miles, not yards. The concept of charging into gun range is obsolete. Yet the principles Johnston demonstrated remain relevant: audacity, resourcefulness, and willingness to accept risk for strategic gain. Modern naval officers study Samar not to replicate Johnston's tactics. Those tactics belong to a different technological era, but to internalize the mindset that drove them. The scenarios change, the principles endure. Johnston's story has been retold in books, documentaries, and academic papers. Each retelling emphasizes different aspects: tactics, leadership, heroism, tragedy. The multiplicity of perspectives reflects the story's richness. It is simultaneously a tactical case study, a leadership lesson, and a human drama. Different audiences extract different meanings. Naval officers focus on decision-making and doctrine. Historians examine the strategic context. General audiences respond to the human elements, courage, sacrifice, the individuals who stood their posts as their ships sank. All perspectives are valid. Johnston's action supports them all. The question posed at the beginning, how does a destroyer weighing less than a single Yamato turret survive a gun duel with the largest battleship afloat? Has a definitive answer: it does not survive. Johnston sank. But survival was never the objective. The objective was to disrupt, to delay, to create uncertainty, to buy time. Measured against that objective, Johnston succeeded completely. She drew fire that would have sunk carriers. She forced Japanese ships to maneuver, losing cohesion and speed. She inflicted damage disproportionate to her size, and she demonstrated that small ships, aggressively handled, could influence battles far beyond their weight class. That lesson justified the cost. Whether the cost was acceptable remains a question each person must answer individually, informed by the knowledge that Johnston's crew chose to pay it willingly, knowing what it meant.